Okay, hi all, so welcome to the second video of the week. We're continuing our look at Descartes on the philosophy of time, so just giving you a bit of background by way of introduction. And I've already mentioned in the previous video then that Descartes was brought up in the scholastic tradition, and it's actually scholasticism which is going to give us the key to understanding these two quotes. So, I'm only giving you here some very, very brief snippets of Descartes' thought, but the point is these are representative of the other things that he tends to say. And I've suggested in the last video that these two snippets suggest that Descartes thinks that time is dependent for its existence on the operations of the mind, and also that it can be identified with the regular motions of the celestial bodies. But I've also said that that's not right. So we've got to be careful. We can't understand Descartes as holding this view, and in fact his view is a more interesting one than the one that it actually suggests. So to understand what's going on, we need to have a look at this distinction that Descartes makes. That's made. It's a scholastic distinction. It comes from the writings of the early Christian philosophers, and it's a distinction between what's called tempus. So this is the notion of a measured duration. So if you think about it like this, imagine that the universe never ever changes. So for the time being, if you can make sense of it, or let's suppose we can make sense of it, Descartes certainly thought he could make sense of the following idea, but at any rate, imagine that the universe it exists over time, but is completely static. So nothing ever changes, nothing ever happens, nothing ever goes on. It's like a frozen universe, if you like, with literally nothing. So there couldn't really be an observer in such a universe, because, an observer, to observe something, it seems to require at least something to change within the observer. But at any rate, imagine that you've got such a thing. The thought there is that universe can't be split up into different temporal parts. There's no sense in which you can kind of say, well, first of all, you've got this period where this happened, then you got this period where this happened. It's just a complete uniformity across time. The idea there, according to Descartes, or Descartes' idea, is that universe there wouldn't have tempus, right? So tempus it applies to those things that change and whose existence can be split into temporal parts. And I think this is also supposed to apply to beings themselves. So even within a universe, if you've got things changing, but you've got some part of the universe which remains frozen, so suppose you've got some, I don't know, what kind of example can we use? Some big rock in the centre of the universe or something that just never changes its properties. It never undergoes any kind of a shift. It just sits there doing nothing. Then that's going to be an example of a thing within a universe that does have things that have got tempus. So, for example, human beings, we've all got tempus because we change over time. But there, the rock wouldn't have tempus. Okay? So I hope that makes sense. I mean, it's not. It's this scholastic distinction, so we'll see. The second thing is duratio. Now, duratio I think that this is really what we should understand by the notion of, time itself in a way. It's duration. So that is a property that's possessed by anything that exists at all. Well, can be possessed by anything that exists. So anything that exists can exist in time, according to Descartes, and in this sense, the thing doesn't need to change, it can remain. So the rock, even if it doesn't change at all, that means it doesn't possess tempus, but it still exists in time. It's just that it exists over time in an unchanging state, and then the rock that we talked about would possess duratio. Right? So, for example, Descartes thought that God was a being that existed in an eternal, unchanging state. So Descartes thought that God had duratio, but didn't have tempus. Right? You can't split God's existence up into these separate parts. All right. So, just to go back again to those quotes, when he gives these quotes and he says time is nothing but a mode of thought, what he's got in mind there is tempus, right? He's got this idea of change involving beings that can be split up into temporal parts. So there his idea seems to be something like, to have tempus, to have a changing thing, you need to have some or changes that occur, I suppose, in a regular fashion, in a temporal fashion. You've got to have some being there that can measure that change. And that's less controversial, right? It's not that duratio, time itself, the existence of things existing over time, depends upon the operations of the mind, but it seems to be something more like, in order to measure time, in order to split things up into temporal parts, it looks like that depends upon the mind, according to Descartes. That's a little less controversial, and maybe, by the way, it's still in line with what Aristotle thought, because it's not entirely clear what Aristotle thought, but nonetheless it's not the view that time, if we think of time as being duratio, it's not that time in that sense is dependent on the mind. Okay, and the second thing, time is the name we give to the, again he's talking about tempus, so the idea here is something like the measurement of time involves, or you can tie that to some regular changes within the universe, and here he's thinking about the movement of the planets, and that seems right to me. I mean, when we split things up and we assign things units of time, I suppose the fundamental one is the day, or the year, or something like that. Then we subdivide it up. I know we use hours and things like that, but that is a subdivision of a day, really. I mean, that was the fundamental unit. That's before people had watches and before they had clocks and so on. They would measure the passage of time in terms of the sun passing over, and the day was the kind of a unit. So yeah, I think that really what he's talking about here is the measurement of time. You need the measurement of time requires a mind to do the measuring, and time in this sense, measured time, is based upon the movements of the planets. So I think that's relatively uncontroversial, right? So it's not that time itself depends upon, there we go. Yeah, I think his view is not the controversial view that time depends upon the operations of the mind. That's duratio. That's what I think time really is. But the uncontroversial view that the measurement of time depends upon the operations of the mind. That's what I think. I mean, again, it's not absolutely clear in some parts of Descartes' writing, and particularly the bits on time, because he's got these scholastic distinctions in play. He's not as clear as he is in other places. But nonetheless, I think that's the view. Yeah, and there he takes the motions of the celestial bodies as being standard measures of time. Alright, but, I mean, there are a couple of things here which I want to draw out, which are of interest. So let me bring up my board. So, a couple of consequences, I suppose, of this, or the way of thinking about some of the issues here, is, alright, let's put a timeline in. Oop. And let's imagine a person. So we'll just draw, again, these kind of a baby stage. So T1, T2, T3, T4. Let's just put these in, T5, T6. So they're just arbitrarily chosen times. So we've got a baby growing up into a young boy playing with a ball. Yeah, there's the boy. Growing up into a man who's fighting in a battle, and then turning into an old person, let's say, with the walking stick. You get the idea. It's a person existing over time. So these are snapshots of their lives at different points. So Descartes has this view then that a being like this, so well, let's now just have up here we've got a rock, and this rock never changes. Okay, so this is by contrast. This rock here never ever changes, right, at every single moment, so it's exactly the same in every respect. So the thought is that with people, we can divide them up, right, into different parts, and that's what it is to have tempus. So the person here has both duratio and tempus, right, because the person exists over time, and you can split them up into different discernible bits. The rock up here, it has duratio, but not tempus. Okay. Oops. Oh dear. Tempus. Alright, so that's just to illustrate this. But now, here's the kind of interesting thing about this. When Descartes' talking about this, he talks about duratio and tempus as being properties of objects themselves. So in actual fact, it's not as if we've got time going on in the background. It's not like time is this thing ticking by and then there are objects existing within time. Rather, the time is constituted by the objects themselves possessing the property of temporality. So this is a rather odd kind of a thought at first, and I'm going to try in this video and the next to try and make it clear. So we'll see in the next video in particular, objects themselves, they're the things that possess time, or probably better put is temporal breadth. So the same as things exist over spatial dimensions, you know, we've got 3 spatial dimensions. So let's take this. The baby here has got, three spatial dimensions, and then it's also got a little bit of like depth here, a little bit of temporal breadth, and you know, so is this bit, and so is this bit, and so is this bit. But we're not here just drawing a little bit of time over which this thing exists. This is to be thought of as a property of the thing itself. So okay, by the way, these will all be joined up by further bits, obviously. Have I done a very good job at explaining that? Maybe not, but we'll come to it in the next video. But look, the other thing to note is, if this is right, by the way, and we can split people up into these different things, we can call these things temporal parts, and we'll see that temporal parts, we'll see that this view, that things that exist over time can be split up into temporal parts, is actually a well-respected view held by contemporary metaphysicians. In fact, it's a view that I think is true. So we'll come to that in due course as well. So this is the thought that, you know, think about it like this. This thing here is one object, this old person, and this thing here is another object, and this is another object, and another. So a person is actually made up of lots of different sort of slices, and really it's probably not right to say that the person exists at any particular time. The person themselves is the collection of all the parts. So that's going to be the idea. So a person on this view is like a space-time worm that's made up of different parts. So that's the kind of temporal part view, and it looks like Descartes held something like that. So worthwhile noting. But the second thing which is important to note is that he also thought that time is a property of material objects. And by the way, that's going to entail that Descartes is a relationist. Why? Well, because if time is a property of material objects, well, a property of a material object can't exist without the object itself, or without any object. You can't just have, for example, free-floating property of squareness. In order to have the property of squareness existing, you have to have a thing which is square. So, if time is a property of objects, you can't have time existing without material objects, and that means that there's a sense, well, it means that time is derivative or dependent upon the existence of material objects, and therefore, right, it can't exist without it. It's not an independently existing thing, and that's what it is to be a relationist. Okay then, so that's just a short 15-minute video. I'm going to split these up into sort of digestible chunks, I suppose, There's the first digestible chunk. So the next video I'm going to finish off the material on Descartes. We're going to talk specifically about Descartes on motion, but I hope this has made sense. I think some of this is a bit tricky to get your head around, but I hope I've made it clear enough.